Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're diving headfirst into the fascinating, messy, and ultimately triumphant story of how the original Macintosh computer came to be.
Yeah, and our guide for this journey, it isn't just any old history book. We're pulling insights from excerpts of Revolution in the Valley, the insanely great story of how the Mac was made,
Right.
which is, pretty unique because it's written by someone who was in the trenches.
Yeah.
Gives you that real behind-the-scenes feel.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to dig into this incredible account, pull out the most important nuggets, the key people, the surprising technical hurdles, the wild team dynamics, and just the sheer audacity of it all. We want to give you the essential story of the early Mac, kind of distilled and brought to life.
Because this isn't just a tale about silicon and circuit boards, is it?
Not at all.
It's about a small group of people trying to make this quantum leap to change how we interact with machines, basically. The graphical user interface they championed, I mean, it now defines modern computing, right? Doesn't matter what logo's on your device.
Totally. That's why this history is still so relevant.
It really is.
Absolutely. It's easy to just take the icons and windows we use every single day for granted. This story, though, it shows the intense effort, the sometimes, frankly, bizarre circumstances that led to them. So where does this revolution even begin?
Well, it starts back in 1979. Apple was doing great, riding high on the Apple II success.
Like, Apple II is huge.
Yeah, groundbreaking for its time. And at the same time, they had the Lisa project underway. That was meant to be their next big thing.
Yeah.
Powerful, expensive, aimed at businesses.
And an early graphical interface, too.
Exactly, featuring an early GUI. But alongside Lisa, almost like an afterthought, Jeff Raskin had this totally different idea.
Okay.
Right. Jeff envisioned something like a low-cost appliance-like computer. Super simple, intuitive, something anyone could afford and use, like without even reading a manual.
Kind of a computer for the rest of us, not just hobbyists.
That was the idea, a personal computer for the masses, not just techies or businesses.
And to build that, he needed some serious hardware talent. Enter Burrell Smith.
Ah, Burrell. Yeah, he was this self-taught tech in Apple's service department, didn't have the standard engineering degree, but he had this incredible, almost Wozniak-level intuition for hardware design, just this knack. And Jeff saw that spark.
And the source talks about his style being kind of wild, right? Like, even more creative than was sometimes.
Oh, yeah. He'd find these incredibly clever, minimalist ways to get complex stuff done with very few chips. Very scrappy.
Like the original Apple II.
Exactly that spirit. His early prototypes had that same feel. And his personality.
Yeah.
Oh, man, the book gives us such great details.
Yeah.
Like, he'd be talking super technical jargon 1 minute and switch to baby talk.
No way.
Yeah, giving people absurd nicknames, doing impressions, and his whole concept of a best friend relationship being highly dynamic and lasting maybe 3 to 5 milliseconds. It tells you a lot about the team's intensity, maybe the volatility too.
Totally bizarre and brilliant. And what's that story about him getting promoted? Something about a mustache?
Oh, that's a classic. Apparently Jeff Raskin joked he'd get the engineer title Burrell wanted when he grew a mustache.
Seriously.
Yep. So Burrell, totally determined, starts cultivating this mustache. Took about a month, apparently. He declares it complete. And literally that afternoon, he gets called in and promoted to member of technical staff.
The mustache did it.
The legend says so. Maybe it just coincided, but that's the story.
That's amazing. So how does Steve Jobs get involved with this kind of quirky, low-cost project?
Well, Steve sees one of Burrell's early boards and just becomes completely obsessed, fixated. He essentially takes the project over, takes it under his wing, and significantly changes its direction. Its scope, too. He moves the small team off campus.
Right, to the Good Earth building, then Texaco Towers.
Exactly. Texaco Towers, that's the more famous one.
And this is where the vision gets bigger.
Yeah.
Way beyond Raskin's original concept.
Oh, totally. It had to be affordable, adaptable, powerful enough to run a full graphical user interface.
Using the Motorola 68,000 chip.
Right, the 68,000. That was key. His vision was making computing accessible to everyone through this revolutionary GUI. He really saw it as, changing the world.
And the team started tiny. Just Jeff, Brian Howard, Burrell. And then Bud Tribble came in.
Yeah, Bud joined a bit later, and he was crucial, absolutely pivotal in pushing for that 68,000.
Ah, okay, so Burrell was maybe thinking simpler before that.
Exactly. Burrell was initially leaning towards something simpler, like the 6809 ship. But Bud, with his deeper technical insight, he convinced Burrell that they needed the 68,000 to pull off the kind of interface Steve was dreaming about.
That decision sounds like it really shifted things.
Oh, it did. It took the project from this, quirky experiment to something that could actually be Apple's future.
But the book makes it clear this wasn't like Apple's golden child project right from the start.
Far from it. It was small, under the radar, often ignored. And the source mentions it was nearly canceled, more than once in those early days.
Wow.
Its existence was pretty precarious within the bigger company.
Okay, but despite that, they kept building. Let's talk hardware.
Yeah.
How did that little board evolve?
Well, Burrell was definitely the heart of the hardware design. He had that early 6809 prototype back in January 1980.
Right.
But once they committed to the 68,000, things changed. They quickly realized the initial plan, 64K of RAM and 8K of ROM, just wasn't going to cut it for the GUI software.
Not nearly enough.
Nope. So by mid-81, they doubled it. 128K RAM, 16K ROM.
Which still sounds incredibly tight by today's standards, like unbelievably small.
Oh, it was. They had to use every trick in the book, pulling some of Wes's old space-saving magic from the Apple II designs, really squeezing everything into that tiny ROM space.
Now, one of the big debates, the source calls it philosophical almost, was Steve Jobs being absolutely adamant about a sealed case. No expansion slots.
Yeah, he saw expandability as a bug. Seriously.
A bug?
Yeah. His view was it just adds complexity for users, for developers. It muddies the pure integrated experience he wanted. He wanted to just work, like an appliance.
But the hardware guys, Burrell and Brian Howard, they must have pushed back, wanted more flexibility.
Oh, they definitely did. The book tells this great story about them trying to sneak in what they called a diagnostic port, secretly hoping, of course, that it could function as a hidden slot for expansion cards later on.
Clever. Did it work?
Nope. Their engineering manager, Rod Holt, spotted it immediately.
Busted.
Totally busted. He looked at it, just called him out. That thing's really a slot, right? You're trying to sneak in a slot. That's not going to happen. End of story.
Okay. Another big fight was the disk drive, right? Build it themselves or buy one?
Precisely. Huge push and pull there. Steve wanted them to develop their own custom 3.5-inch drive, maybe with a partner like Alps. He specifically told the team, stop working with Sony on their existing 3.5-inch drive.
Which was probably more proven technology at that point.
Exactly. And key people like Bob Belleville, George Crow, Larry Kenyon, they kind of went rogue. They kept working with Sony secretly.
Secretly. Against Jobs' orders.
Yep. They just didn't believe the internal effort could hit the deadlines. Larry Kenyon apparently had to, hide the Sony drive under his desk whenever Steve Jobs came visiting.
Wow. That tells you something about the pressure.
And the disagreements, yeah. Clandestine work.
Okay, switching gears to the look and feel, the industrial design. Steve was famously demanding there, too.
Incredibly so. He brought in Jerry Manick, who did the Apple II case, and Terry Oyama. And the book describes Steve pointing to things like, the precision of a Porsche or a Ferrari.
Wow.
Or even the finish on a Cuisinart blender he saw at Macy's. That was the kind of aesthetic he wanted. He was absolutely fanatical about details, like the chamfers, the curves, the bezel around the screen.
And the handle on top, that was pretty unique.
Yeah, such a distinctive feature. The source suggests it might have been inspired by the handle on the French Minitel terminal, which was around then. Adding that handle really pushed the idea of the Mac being personal, portable, even though it weighed, 16 pounds?
Still, it gave that impression and sound. Was that important early on?
Actually, yeah. Burrell Smith had this great vision for sound. He wanted a built-in generator for independent voices.
Pretty ambitious for the time.
Very.
Yeah.
Initially, it was going to be mostly hardware, but they ended up shifting a lot of it into software. But what's interesting is Steve's involvement even there?
How so?
He apparently approved spending an extra dollar, just $1, on an improved amplifier because Burrell insisted the sound quality needed to be excellent.
Huh. So even tiny cost details,
Yeah.
if they affected the user experience.
He'd focus on them, yeah. It shows his focus wasn't just big picture.
Okay, so the hardware is taking shape, but the real magic, the soul of the Mac, that was the software, the user interface. And Bill Atkinson's Quick Draw, that was foundational, wasn't it, for both Lisa and Mac?
Absolutely fundamental. Quick Draw was the graphics library that made the whole visual thing possible. Drawing lines, text, shapes, bitmapped images. incredibly fast for the time.
And this story about the rounded rectangles. You have to tell that one.
Oh, it's a classic. Steve Jobs saw Bill's demo, loved it, but he had this one demand. It has to draw rectangles with rounded corners.
Just like that.
Just like that. Bill initially thought it was like crazy difficult, maybe impossible to do quickly. But Steve was Steve. He didn't drop it.
Oh.
He literally took Bill for a walk around the block, pointing out every single rounded rectangle they saw, whiteboards, desks, even a no parking sign.
He was relentless.
Totally. And it worked. Bill went back and somehow, against his initial doubts, figured out this incredibly fast algorithm for drawing round rects.
And they became iconic Mac elements.
Exactly. All because Steve wouldn't let it go.
Those early demos must have been pretty wild to see back then.
Oh, yeah. Things like McSketch, for mouse drawing, or the famous Bouncing Pepsis demo. They used that one to wow executives like John Scully.
Yeah.
Just colored balls bouncing around in Windows. Simple now, but revolutionary then.
And the Finder, the file manager, that went through changes too. I read Bruce Horn and Andy Hertzfeld initially played with draggable tabs instead of folder icons.
That's right. They prototyped that idea, tabs for files. But ultimately, they realized the folder metaphor just made more sense visually for organizing stuff.
A key decision.
Yeah, and it influenced not just the Mac, but Lisa's file system, too.
Another key usability concept, the desk accessories.
Ah, yes, the DAs. Those little utilities, calculator, alarm clock, notepad, you could pull them down from a menu in any application.
Right, without closing what you were doing.
Exactly. It made the computer feel more like a real desktop,
Yeah.
Quick access to tools. The source mentions TestStorm was the basic template program they used for building them.
And the calculator story.
Yeah.
Classic Steve Jobs demanding aesthetic perfection again.
Oh, absolutely. Chris Espinosa wrote the first version, and Steve apparently hated the look. Background too dark, lines too thick, buttons too big. Just ripped it apart aesthetically.
Oh, Chris.
Yeah, Chris kept revising it, getting this incredibly detailed, probably maddening feedback from Steve over and over.
Until Chris came up with the Steve Jobs roll your own calculator construction set. That's brilliant.
Isn't it? He built this special interface where Steve could literally use menus to design his own perfect calculator. Layout, appearance, everything.
And Steve actually used it.
Apparently.
Huh.
He played with it for a while, finally got a design he liked, and boom, that was the end of the feedback on the calculator's look.
That level of focus.
Wait.
Wow. Okay, and the control panel, another DA. Very graphical.
Yeah, designed by Susan Kerr, who did so many of the Mac's iconic visuals. Someone, maybe a reviewer, apparently called it a crib toy.
A crib toy.
Yeah, maybe a bit condescendingly. Because of the simple sliders and buttons like the little rabbit and tortoise icons for mouse speed. But that simplicity was the point. Make complex settings intuitive.
Right. Underneath all that friendliness, though, the system software had big challenges, especially managing memory with just 128K.
Oh, huge challenges. But Tribble did the initial memory management code, and he was influenced by Charles Simonyi from Xerox PR Art.
Okay.
And Simonyi had this Hungarian Pascal coding style. The source describes it variable names with no vowels, type prefixes, partly because of old compiler limits.
Sounds hard to read.
Yeah, but apparently had to do some serious cleanup to make that code readable and maintainable later on.
And a really crucial piece that came in quite late was the resource manager.
Yes, Bruce Horn developed that. And it was fundamental. It let Mac apps separate their code from their data, like text strings, icons, window layouts.
Which made things like translation easier.
Much easier. Or just changing the look and feel without rewriting the core program logic. Super important.
But Bob Belleville, the engineering manager, he initially resisted it. Thought it was too risky late in the game.
He did. He only gave Bruce Horn 30 days to implement it, which was just an insane deadline for something so foundational.
30 days. Wow. Bruce must have been pulling all-nighters.
Pretty much, yeah. He got a slight extension, but he barely made that deadline. Barely. But he did make it. And the resource manager became absolutely core to how Mac software worked.
And for developers to actually use all this stuff, they needed good documentation. The Inside Macintosh project sounds massive.
Monumental effort. Apparently the early drafts were, well, pretty bad, reflecting how complex and maybe rushed some of the code was.
But then Caroline Rose joined, a programmer turned writer.
Exactly. And the source credits her not just with improving the writing, but actually improving the software design.
How so?
By asking tough questions. As she tried to document the APIs, she'd find inconsistencies, confusing parts, and that forced the engineers to clarify or sometimes even fix the underlying design.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And Steve Jobs also insisted on incredibly high production standards for the final books. That 3-volume set showed how much he valued enabling developers.
And just a little bit of classic Apple cheekiness hiding a stolen from Apple icon deep in the ROM.
Huh? Yeah. Designed by Susan Kerr, compressed by Steve Capps. Just this little bitmap hidden away. You had to know a specific magic address in the debugger to even see it.
A little warning to cloners. Did it ever actually get triggered?
As far as the source suggests, probably not in a copied ROM, but the rumor it was there, that probably acted as a deterrent. It's just such a great example of that unique Mac team culture.
Speaking of team culture, what was life like for the people building this thing? The source calls it the Little Kingdom.
Yeah, they had this incredibly strong identity. Working in those separate buildings, Texaco Towers, kind of isolated from the rest of Apple. They were getting recognized within the company, sure, but also stirring up controversy.
A lot of that seemed to come from friction with the Lisa team, right?
Oh, huge friction. They were competing for resources, for attention, and they had really different philosophies about where Apple should be heading.
The Mac being seen as a threat to the high-end Lisa.
Exactly. Some on the Lisa team saw the Mac as this disruptive, lower-cost thing that could undermine their sophisticated product. The source mentioned some intense moments, like Rich Page on the Lisa team having this emotional outburst, genuinely believing the Mac would destroy Lisa, maybe even ruin Apple.
Wow, high stakes.
Really intense feelings. And the Mac team had to do stuff like, secretly borrow a Lisa machine from John Couch's office.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so they could use it to develop Mac software and demo it to partners like Microsoft without the Lisa team knowing or trying to block them. They were sharing resources behind the scenes. That led to the Lisa building getting nicknamed Taco Towers by the Mac folks.
Taco Tower. Okay. The management dynamics also sound challenging. Those stories about Steve Jobs' interview questions.
Yeah.
Asking about virginity or LSD.
Yeah, those definitely give you a sense of the unconventional, high-pressure vibe. And Steve's sometimes, inappropriate intensity.
And there was real conflict with Bob Belleville when he became engineering manager.
Oh, yeah. A really notable incident was Bob giving Andy Hertzfeld, one of the absolute core software gurus, this surprisingly negative performance review.
Why?
It's not entirely clear from the source, maybe personality clashes, management style. But Steve Jobs found out, was absolutely furious, confronted Bob, basically tore up the review.
Wow.
And Bob ended up resigning from that management role shortly after. Huge drama.
That kind of stress must have just been constant. Andy Hertzfeld eventually took a leave of absence, right? Burnout.
He did, which, given the pace, isn't surprising at all. The book includes this really strange detail about Steve Jobs' comment at Andy's farewell dinner.
What was it?
Something like, "The thing I like best about Andy is that it's so easy to make him cry."
Oof. Yikes. What do you even say to that?
Right. Weird.
Yeah.
But the team culture was intense, fueled by those insane hours.
The 90 hours a week and loving its sweatshirt.
Exactly. Based on an exaggerated quote, maybe attributed to Steve. But the software team, who were probably closest to actually working those hours, they were apparently a bit annoyed that everyone else got the shirts too.
Huh. But there was also this intense pride, wasn't there? Feeling like artists. Signing the inside of the case.
Yeah, that's such a powerful symbol. It was their way of signing their masterpiece, feeling like they were creating something truly monumental.
Though that caused issues later when the team grew.
Yeah, later editions didn't get to sign, which caused some resentment, growing pains.
And the book throws in these real-world events, too, impacting the team. Was his U.S. festival.
Right, and that bizarre incident where Bill Graham had Burl Smith kicked off stage during Wooz's event, and Bill Atkinson's really serious car accident, nearly decapitated. Steve apparently drove straight to the hospital.
Just underscores these were real people under immense pressure.
Absolutely, with lives and challenges outside the bubble.
And surprisingly, the source mentions compensation wasn't always amazing, especially for some key early people.
That was quite a revelation, yeah. People like Bud Tribble, Burl Smith, apparently had relatively low salaries compared to others at Apple.
Really?
Yeah, they complained and were sometimes met with these philosophical arguments from management about paying based on need, not talent. And their offices weren't exactly plush either, especially compared to the main campus.
Interesting. Steve Jobs being tight on some things?
While simultaneously signing off on massive budgets for things he valued, like marketing.
Which brings us nicely to the launch lead-up. Marketing was key, and for the first year and a half, Joanna Hoffman was the marketing team.
Incredible, right? Just her. And she initially focused heavily on the college market.
Smart move.
Yeah, recognizing students, faculty, especially at top universities, could be influential early adopters. The whole Macintosh consortium idea, offering discounts, came from that.
They visited places like Brown University.
Right, Andy Hertzfeld's alma mater. And the source mentions this funny anecdote from the Brown visit. Someone asked, "What's a megaflop?"
Shows the gap they were bridging.
Totally. Between the cutting-edge tech and the audience they needed to reach.
Okay, a hugely significant step, though, was partnering with Microsoft.
Absolutely critical. Getting essential software, a spreadsheet like Multiplan, charting, Word onto the Mac early was vital. Steve Jobs met with Bill Gates. They struck a deal.
Which led to some interesting logistical challenges during development.
Oh, yeah. Because the Mac software was actually being developed on Lisa machines.
Right.
They had to literally hide the Lisa development systems whenever the Microsoft engineers came to visit Apple. Couldn't let them see.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
But then, fast forward to November '83, Microsoft makes a move that really ticked Apple off.
Oh, yeah. They announced Windows at Comdex, their own mouse-based graphical environment for IBM PCs.
Ouch. From Apple's view, that looked like blatant copying.
Totally. The book recounts Steve Jobs just exploding when he confronted Bill Gates.
What did he say?
Reportedly yelled something like, "You're ripping us off. I trusted you, and now you're stealing from us." Pretty direct.
And Gates' legendary response, that famous line.
It's a classic. Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set only to find that you had already stolen it.
Wow. Just, wow. Brilliant, cutting, and points right back at Xerox PRC.
Exactly. And technically, it turned out Microsoft was kind of covered by a loophole in their contract related to ship dates. Plus, Apple still desperately needed those Microsoft apps.
So they couldn't just walk away.
Nope. Stuck with them.
Okay, the marketing peak, though, has to be the 1984 commercial.
Oh, absolutely iconic. Proposed by the Chiat Day agency, Steve Jobs loved it instantly. Unprecedented budget, too, like over $750,000 for one ad.
Directed by Ridley Scott, fresh off Blade Runner. And it was controversial, right? Barely showed the computer.
Exactly. It was all this powerful symbolic message, breaking free from IBM's, Big Brother dominance.
Yeah, and airing it during the Super Bowl.
Genius move. Became an instant cultural event. Generated massive free press because news shows kept replaying it, talking about it. The Apple board, who'd been nervous about the cost and the lack of product shots, they reportedly gave the Mac team a standing ovation after the launch. They got it then.
But right up to that launch, January 24th, 1984, it was total chaos behind the scenes.
Absolute madness. The mantra was, real artists ship, get it out the door, even if it's not perfect.
Deadlines looming.
Oh, yeah. Software still being finished, debugging around the clock. The source tells the story about Andy Hertzfeld being so exhausted trying to fix a clipboard bug, Steve Capps basically had to help him type the fix in middle of the night.
They even pushed the factory disk duplication deadline back, like to the absolute last minute.
Yep, 6 a.m. Monday morning, just to get a couple more days for software tweaks.
And even then, a nasty bug surfaced late. The disk swapper's elbow. Sounds painful.
It was painful for users. It happened if you were copying disks and you accidentally dropped the disk icon onto the desktop instead of the target disk window. A simple mistake.
Okay.
But it triggered this incredibly inefficient process. The Mac would just sit there swapping disks back and forth dozens of times for one copy instead of just a few. Maddening.
And the team had trouble finding it because they were all expert mouse users. They didn't make that mistake.
Exactly. They were too good with the mouse to easily reproduce it. It just shows how real-world users are different from developers.
Finally, launch day. Shareholders meeting. Nerves must have been off the charts.
Absolutely. Especially hoping the demo software would work perfectly live. The Mac actually introduced itself using a speech synthesizer program called SAM.
Right, and the first words were legendary.
Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, followed by never trust a computer that you can't lift. Then it introduced Steve Jobs. Classic.
There was even some last-minute drama with Newsweek about the cover.
Yeah, crazy story. They had this cover shot already featuring the Mac team, but some gossip column leaked that the cover was happening.
Gaffa.
So Newsweek pulled it last minute, ran a standby cover about airline safety instead. The Big Mac article was still inside, thankfully.
And had some fun with that.
Oh yeah, total prankster. He was on a flight with Andy and Burl, saw them reading the Newsweek article about themselves. He gets the flight attendants involved.
Yeah.
Convinces them to ask Andy and Burl for autographs because they were famous people from Newsweek, much to their total embarrassment.
That's brilliant. Okay, so post-launch, the Mac was initially a huge hit. Sales were good.
Huge success out of the gate. Sales blew past Steve Jobs' aggressive target, 50,000 units in 100 days. They hit over 72,000. Sold another 60,000 plus just in June '84 alone.
That must have felt like incredible validation after all that craziness.
Absolutely. And seeing third-party developers actually showing off Mac software at big trade shows like the National Computer Conference in '84, that really cemented the feeling like, okay, we actually did it. Steve was apparently ecstatic.
And even after launch, after Andy Hertzfeld took his leave, the innovation kept going, building on what they'd learned. Andy worked on the Thunder scanner.
Yeah, applying Bill Atkinson's grayscale algorithms, Bill was always refining those, moving from ordered dither to Floyd Steinberg methods for better image quality.
Right.
And Andy used that tech in the scanner software, showed it off to journalists like John Markoff.
And Andy's experience seeing multitasking, even on an IBM PC, sparked an idea for something the Mac really needed: an application switcher.
Yes. Especially as the Mac moved to 512K RAM, multitasking felt more possible. Microsoft was interested too, partly because of competition like Lotus Jazz. They even tried to hire Andy to write it.
And Bill Gates apparently tried his negotiation tactics, challenging Andy on how fast a really good programmer could do it.
According to the source, yeah. Typical Gates, maybe. Which kind of spurred Andy to just develop it independently. He dove into this legendary, 20-hour coding marathon to bang out the first prototype of Switcher.
20 hours straight. Wow. And Steve Jobs saw it.
Saw it, loved it instantly, saw the potential. But then, classic Jobs negotiation. He basically just fixed the price Apple would pay for it at $100,000. Argued Andy couldn't have done it without using Apple's confidential info resources. Andy accepted, finished Switcher, and crucially added features like the ability to force quit hung applications, which was vital if you were trying to juggle multiple programs.
Looking back at the whole thing, the book includes these mea culpa sections, team members admitting to technical mistakes in that early system software.
Yeah, and it's really revealing. Andy Hertzfeld is very open about what he considers his biggest blunder, using the high-order bits in memory pointers for flag.
Okay, why was that a blunder?
It seemed efficient for the 68,000's 24-bit addressing, but when processors went to 32-bit, it caused years of problems. Making software 32-bit clean became this massive headache later on.
Unforeseen consequences. And his second mistake:
using fixed low-memory addresses for critical system globals, the toolbox globals, again, influenced by simpler systems like the Apple II, may be convenient for the 68,000. But it fundamentally hamstrung true multitasking. It made it incredibly difficult for multiple applications to run simultaneously without very complex workarounds, really limited the Mac for a long time.
So some really core architectural decisions had these major long-term impacts.
They really did. The source mentions others too, like Bill Atkinson using signed 16-bit integers in QuickDraw, limiting graphic sizes, and Bruce Horn using 16-bit offsets in the Resource Manager, limiting resource file sizes. Little things that became big limits later.
And that big philosophical choice, the sealed box, limited hardware expansion, while maybe courageous for simplicity's sake, it just proved impractical pretty quickly, didn't it, as tech moved on?
Exactly. Memory needs exploded, hard drives became essential.
Yeah.
That lack of easy expansion really became a major bottleneck for the platform down the road.
Finally, there's always that question. Who really was the father of the Macintosh?
Yeah, the source tackles that. It gives Jeff Raskin definite credit for starting the whole thing, for that initial vision, low-cost, easy-to-use appliance. And, crucially, for recruiting amazing early talent like Atkinson, Burrell Smith, Bud Tribble, Joanna Hoffman.
Key hires.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the book also notes just how different the final product was from Raskin's original concept, especially after Steve Jobs took over, elevated the vision, demanded the power for that full GUI.
Right.
So the book kind of positions Raskin maybe more like the eccentric great uncle than the sole father of the Mac that actually shipped.
Interesting take. What really shines through in this whole story, though, regardless of titles, is just the sheer spirit of that team.
Oh, absolutely. That intense passion, the crazy long hours, that almost messianic belief largely fueled by Steve Jobs. Let's be honest that they were building something genuinely world-changing.
Yeah. I really felt they were making a quantum leap. Creating a computer that wasn't just functional, but accessible, intuitive, maybe even enjoyable for ordinary people. all thanks to that graphical interface.
It's just an incredible narrative, isn't it? From this tiny, almost killed-off research project
Right.
to a product that completely reshaped personal computing.
The GUI they pioneered, I mean, it's just everywhere now.
Yeah.
Every phone, tablet, computer. Doesn't matter the OS. The impact is undeniable, baked into our digital lives.
And yet, it's kind of striking that the source ends on this note, that the original Macintosh dream, making computers truly easy and intuitive for everyone, maybe still isn't fully realized.
Yeah.
That computers can still be pretty frustratingly difficult for a lot of ordinary users.
Which is a really provocative thought to end on, isn't it? Especially after hearing all this, considering all the technical mistakes the team themselves acknowledge, the intense human conflicts, the pressure, the clashes. What does this whole story tell us about how revolutionary innovation actually happens? Yeah, like, is perfection even required to change the world? Or can these groundbreaking, world-altering products emerge from messy, imperfect processes, from challenging circumstances, from brilliant but deeply flawed people just pushing boundaries together?
Definitely something to think about next time you're clicking an icon or dragging a window around your screen.